LinkedIn, and welcome to this week's LinkedIn Live. I'm delighted to be joined by Fania Stoney from Great Place to Work. We've recorded a podcast episode, we released a recorded podcast episode a few weeks ago now, talking about everything that it means to be a great place to work. So we've covered a wide range of topics, Fania. I think you'll agree. We talked about things like culture, we talked about menopause at work and recognising women at work and creating better working environments, generally speaking. Fania, you want to give people a little bit about your background, who you are, and then we can share some of the highlights from the full podcast episode. For anyone who is tuned in live today or even watching on the replay, do feel free to link to there's a link to the full podcast episode below. So if you haven't listened to the full podcast episode yet, do go and check that. If you have any comments or questions as we go through today, feel free to drop them below. We'll see them popping up in the comments on this software. We're not actually on LinkedIn doing this. It's through third-party software. Long story. But if you want to pop the comments, we should see them now, or we'll check them out later as well. So Fania, back to you.
Perfect. Aoife, well done. Like, that's an amazing amount of admin you just wrapped up in about 30 seconds. I'm always so impressed when people do that. It's just like bish, bash, bash. And look, thanks again for having me as part of it. And it's great to kind of be doing the LinkedIn Live and all that kind of stuff. So hello, everybody. So yeah, my name is Fania Stoney. I'm the Business Development Strategist with Great Place to Work. So I've been there for about 7 years. And it was my main role is kind of figuring out where we can have our next big impact and kind of pushing the business to kind of figure out new ways that we can support supporting organizations. And then Great Place to Work from an overall point of view, we assess workplace culture. We're generally best known for our Trust Index survey and our best workplaces in Ireland list that comes out every year. But we work with a range of organisations of different scales, different industries, different sizes, and have that belief that any workplace can create a great culture and help organisations to do that.
And do you know what, quite randomly, coincidentally, because I add podcasts to my podcast playlist on Apple all the time, and I have a long list of kind of podcasts to get through, but quite randomly, when I was out on my walk this morning, the podcast that I was listening to was the Red Cube podcast with yeah, like just very, very randomly, but really interesting insights and really great people that he has on the show as well. But one of the things that kind of, I suppose one of the areas that we covered in our conversation was the future of work, and the fact that we talk about the future of work as if it's in the future, but actually the future of work is kind of happening now. Do you want to maybe elaborate on that point a little bit?
Yeah, I think we've all got kind of stuck in this habit of thinking about this hypothetical future of work that's suddenly going to make sense to everybody and everybody's going to have it figured out and that kind of piece. And I think we're very much seeing now for organizations that like we're here, right? I think we need to stop talking about this future piece and start accepting the version of reality that we find ourselves in right now.
Yeah.
I think there's still a lot of experimentation and figuring out going on. Like, I wouldn't want anybody tuning into this or the podcast to think anybody has it figured out, because I actually don't think they do.
Yeah,
but
it's true. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's like in that space, work is happening. Like, people are turning up, they're doing their work, they're delivering for their teams. And I think we've got to start meeting people where they're at in all of that and kind of stop putting off this piece of future. It's like, no, we're here and we need to support people to do their best work now. We want organizations to be able to deliver now, and we want people to be in the best fit for them, you know, and kind of be part of that journey moving forward.
And I think it's really important for people to know that. I find all the time with my clients, they're kind of like, what's Johnny down the road doing? Like, what are they doing? Or what are the best practice? What are the learnings that you can take from other organizations that you work with? And like, I always bring it back to, you need to listen internally to your own people. You can't just copy what other people are doing. Maybe you can use a framework, but you can't necessarily be like, okay, they've done this and this, let's do that as well, because it's going to work for us, because that's not going to work. You really have to personalize it for your own organization. And, you know, and I think since we're talking about the future of work, and the future of work is now, how about hybrid? And I don't think it's anything, we went into a little bit of detail in the full podcast episode in relation to new starters and younger workers. And I know certainly when I was starting out in my career, how important it was to have that social aspect to work, essentially, and being able to connect with other people and being able to learn from other people, just by being in the office, seeing how things are done, but kind of not necessarily in an official capacity. But I think hybrid is something in particular that a lot of organizations are struggling with. And again, they're looking to learn from other organizations. Any thoughts yourself on that? Whether it's, you need to listen, or there is something that can be learned from best practice.
Yeah, and like Aoife, we're so aligned on that, right? Like the listening piece is so key. And again, it's kind of understanding that even the notion of hybrid is going to mean different things to different people. Different leaders are going to exhibit it in a different way. Different people are going to need different supports in that space. I think there's been a lot of chat in the, which I think is really important around, especially kind of parents at work, and how much that hybrid approach has allowed people to, not lose time with their kids to a commute, and rethink that kind of childcare piece and all that. And while that's really important, there are also everybody else experiencing the hybrid piece, right? And what that means for them and what they value, and how we manage to kind of bring that to the fore for everybody. I think as a general trend across kind of all of our clients now, we have some who are completely remote first, and we have some who are, will never be able to offer remote working. It might be retail or healthcare or something like that, right? So we have either end of the spectrum. But I think for most who are going after that kind of hybrid model, it does seem to be 2 to 3 days back, right? And the learnings have been what some people might seem as relatively simple, but have big impact. So if we're talking about coming back for a couple of days a week, it might be worth teams coordinating so they see each other, right? And they you're not coming in on the day where the rest of your team is actually not there, and you don't get the positive byproduct of actually seeing the people you've been chatting to online all week.
And you spend your time in the office on Zoom, on meetings with people who are at home.
Yeah. And like we have there's one of our clients is Distilled SCH, so you would know them as Dundeal and Daffs and Adverts and Gumtree, so they're the kind of umbrella brand for those guys. And Laura, their head of people, is kind of interesting in this. She says, look, we tell our people, we're very upfront. If you look at your calendar and you see you're in back-to-back online meetings, don't come into the office. Like, you're not going to benefit from getting in your car and driving to the office and having to sit in back-to-back online meetings all day. But also, it is okay to not have back-to-back meetings all day. And actually, part of us coming back together is to be intentional around the connection. Like in a pre-COVID world, we didn't really think much about having a chat and going for maybe a longer coffee and that kind of thing. And now this is like hyper diarization of life. It's like, oh, if I'm not accounting for every single minute in my diary, I'm not being productive. But actually building connection, being intentional around connection, as a leader, getting to know your team, as a team, getting to know your peers, that's actually part of work, and I think we've lost that a little bit, and people kind of refinding that now is kind of an interesting kind of piece that we're seeing kind of happening moving forward.
I've just spotted a comment coming through there from Dora. She's asking for this conversation to be in Spanish. I'd love to be able to have this conversation in Spanish. I don't know how your Spanish is, Fania.
I mean, hola, ¿qué tal?
Okay.
That's about it.
That's kind of, I didn't make any assumptions. That's kind of what I thought. I'm not going to do a one-way Spanish conversation about this podcast. I'm sorry, Dora. And I am actually, I'm considering, how do I get the podcast translated? Can I get it translated by AI? Because I certainly don't want to have to re-record 163 or 4 episodes in Spanish myself. I think that would be kind of hard to do. I do speak Spanish. I think that's probably why she's asking.
Oh, there you go.
One of the things.
I was going to say, here's an interesting thing on that, right? And again, we were working with a client through this last week. One of the really positive pieces about a lot of Irish workplaces, we have really such a diverse workforce, right? So people working in different languages and all that kind of stuff. And one of the things that's been challenged in the online kind of version of work is we kind of, like, stuff does get lost in translation. And because we're not together, we don't have the chance to kind of like jump in and be like, okay, I know we say this, but actually we probably mean that. And the example that came up a couple of weeks ago is like, when you have a minute, will you book the meeting room? And of course, what we actually mean is you need to book that now. Like, it's not like you have a minute like that, the translation of that is, I need you to do that piece of work right away. And actually how we help people kind of come together and that kind of Irishism and bringing that, and again, without that in-person connection, how do you manage some of those moments that just kind of slip through the cracks of translation?
So interesting you say that, because I had a conversation a couple of weeks ago with my cousin. Irish parents, grew up in London and lives in Spain now, working as a teacher. And she said, would you like to come to the front of the classroom? It was something to that effect. And there was it was mostly Spanish kids, and they didn't, he's like, no, I would like to come to the front of the classroom or whatever it was. And there was a guy who was a mix. He had like a UK, he had grown up in the UK or had one British parent or something like that. And he's kind of given a nudge saying, that means you need to go to the front of the classroom now, you know, like it's whole.
It was phrased as an option, but you don't have an option here. Yeah,
exactly. The explanation of that means that like that's a request as opposed to like, a question or whatever. Like they're telling me to do that. Anyway, back to the main purpose of the podcast. One of the things that we talked about, and this comes up an awful lot on the podcast, is this idea of management tends to be the only way that people view progression in their careers. Yeah. And it's just a challenge that assumption. It's come up again and again and again on the podcast as like, how can we as leaders provide opportunity to people that is a path to becoming a specialist or even a generalist, but in a more senior role, rather than having to manage other people, which I think a lot of managers, when they first start managing people, myself included, it's actually much harder than you think. You're enticed by the title, the pay rise, the recognition, but then reality is things that you have to deal with people's day-to-day stuff. I'm not going to go much further than that, but like you have to deal with people's personal issues essentially, you know, and all of that goes with it. So any stories around that you wanted to share?
Yeah, and it's definitely something we hear a lot, right? Which is, you know, I'm really, really, really good at my job, so they made me a people manager, and it was just like, you know, like why? I'm not sure why this became the route for me, and we're definitely seeing. I suppose it's the leaders in this space, I suppose, are a few kind of the guys we work with in tech, and they're beginning to realize that, you know, the only path to progression or progression path shouldn't be into people management. And actually we've seen people trying a couple of things, like not getting a pay rise when you become a people manager. So people aren't chasing the pay. You know, to be a people manager, it's got to be something you actually want to do and you know, have a grow for. You know, you can't just kind of like, oh yeah, sure, that's my next obvious pay rise, so I'll go for that. So kind of trying different like that. Again,
that's that interesting,
yeah, and again, that product or technical expertise, and you know, we're kind of going up that way. But even some of the language around it is changing. I know we chatted about this in more depth on the podcast, with this idea of, you know, maybe your ladder's on the wrong walls. So like rethinking the entire structure of what that progression could look like for you. And again, one I've heard of since is they don't actually talk about ladders and walls. They talk about sunbeams, and you know, everyone's moving towards the same central goal, but your beam to get there might be slightly different, and you could like, you know, jump across different beams and that kind of thing. Again, just getting people to think even like conceptually that it's not an up and down piece. It's actually, there might be different routes in, but we're all progressing towards the same overall goal. And then the final piece I'd say there is what are the other things that are going on within the organization that people can get involved in? Is it, you know, the likes of resource groups or committees or, you know, different interest groups, whatever those kind of things are. That bring out a different kind of side for people and a different way of kind of, again,
a different skill at it. An opportunity to show your strengths in a different way, I think. And what I'm seeing with the organizations I work with is a lot more recognition of contribution that you make to those groups, the recognition of how important those groups are to begin with. But then if you're contributing in no small way to the success of how that group is done, then that's actually being account for, and that's being recognized by the business, and not just you did thing, or your boss is thinking, wow, she spent an awful lot of time on that, but it's actually not contributing to the bottom line or whatever that might be. But what I've seen is that it's being recognized more and more, and it's being taken care of in those end-of-year discussions, in those development discussions, in those career discussions. So really brilliant to see those kinds of things being recognized at work.
Yeah, and those multiple layers of performance, right? Performance is going to look different for different people at different stages. And again, I know we went into this a good bit on the podcast, but like it is all underpinned by performance, right? So we can do lots of nice things, but if we're not ultimately able to measure and deliver and be able to kind of demonstrate the value and the performance that we're doing, then we're just kind of doing stuff for the sake of it as well. So it's kind of the balance in all of that, right? The final piece, the final piece we've seen in there is actually some of the organizations working very hard to not have people what they would call like career progressors. Like they know how to talk the talk, they know how to walk the walk, and they rise
They're VSers, basically.
yeah, exactly. They rise the ranks very quickly, and they kind of figure out the game.
They talk the talk.
Exactly, yeah, and bringing other metrics.
Around a few of those. Yeah.
And we all have, right? And you can here we go again.
Gaming the system, trampling on people as they rise through the ranks as well. So I mean, to be fair to one of the organizations I worked for in the past, they talked a lot about not just the what, but the how. How do you get your work done?
Exactly.
It wasn't always implemented in the way I would, but I think that's really important, is demonstrating the values of the organization and how you get stuff done. So like, are you respecting people? Are you collaborating? Or are you like in competition? Are you trampling all over? Are you damaging relationships? Are you damaging maybe the long-term relationships with clients because of the way that you're behaving in business and things like that? But it's really interesting to see that kind of stuff being called out now, and people finally recognizing, I think, when that happens at work. I suppose the last thought I wanted to share is, you have any kind of final words in relation to the podcast, any final tips to share, and a reason, I suppose, if people haven't gone to that full episode yet, a reason that they tune into that full episode.
Yeah, I mean, I often come back to this, right? We're all inherently curious and nosy, right? So we want to know kind of what's happening in other organizations, what is it? And while we can't copy and paste, what can we steal with pride? What are people saying and that kind of thing? So I think throughout all of that, there's our chat, there's a lot of, little nuggets around what organizations are actually doing to corporate culture.
Yeah.
But the second piece is from an individual perspective. And I know you set all of your podcasts up so well, which is like, as an individual, what's the action I'm going to take, and what have I learned from this, and how do I codify that learning? And kind of like, I hope in the middle of all of that, for somebody, there's a sense of, actually, I need to begin to craft who it is that I am in my organization, what it is that I'm delivering, and then doing that exercise around how and what they're delivering for me, and figuring out that fit piece. Because I know I said it on the podcast, but I really believe, great talent deserves great culture. It's about figuring out that fit for you. That's
my favorite quote. That's my favorite quote from the podcast. Something I really took away, because I don't think I'd heard it before. Like, maybe you've said it a million times, but I've never heard expressed in that way. And I think it's so true. And I think great talent leaves when there isn't a great culture as well. And it is, going back to your point, I think it's more about the fit. And I've done all of my research on that. Like, it's more about the fit than like finding the person. It's finding the right people for your organizations where they can really thrive in the environment that you've created. But I mean, really well synopsized. I don't know if that word, but it's
synopsized. No, I don't even know.
But really well summarized there. So some really valuable point, I think, that people will take a lot away from that podcast episode. So for anyone who hasn't listened to it yet, you can click on the link below. There's a link to that. For anyone who wants to connect directly with Fania, she's tagged in the post that this event is on. So feel free to follow, connect, whatever. If you're watching this on the replay, or if you're still watching live, then feel free to drop a comment below, and we'd be happy to answer any questions that you have. And do always, I love getting feedback on the podcast episodes, so do let us know what you thought of the podcast episode. And a reminder, people sometimes think that this is podcast. This is not podcast. This is a LinkedIn Live. The podcast, this is a post-podcast discussion about the podcast episode. The full episode link is below, so do go and check that out. And thank you, Fania, for your time and your wisdom, your expertise today, and also on the podcast. We really enjoyed the chat, so thank you.
Talk to you soon. Bye, Eva.